Okay, let's dive in. We're unpacking a really intense moment here, those big Israeli strikes on Iran.
Yeah, the ones hitting military and, crucially, nuclear sites early on June 13th, 2025.
Exactly. And this isn't happening in a vacuum, is it? You've got months of tension building up.
Right. Think back to October 7th, 2023, with Hamas, then Hezbollah right after, and that major Iranian attack on Israel in April 2024. It's all connected.
So for this deep dive, we've gathered insights from quite a few places.
We're looking at analysis from groups like the Atlantic Council, GINZA,
Plus news reports from outlets like NPR, Reuters.
and even tapping into some online forum discussions to get a broader feel.
Our goal here is really just to cut through the noise for you. What happened? Why did the sources say it happened? And what could it all mean?
Trying to get to those core insights you need.
So let's jump straight into the event itself, June 13th. What did the sources tell us actually happened?
Well, the reports we've seen describe Israeli jets hitting dozens of targets across Iran early morning.
Dozens. And the targets were pretty specific.
Yeah, military installations were definitely hit. But the focus, in many reports, was on nuclear sites.
Nuclear sites, that jumps out. Any specific locations mentioned?
Natanz, the enrichment facility there, was named pretty consistently.
Right, Natanz. And maybe just quickly, for anyone listening, why is hitting an enrichment facility like Natanz such a big deal?
Good point. Enrichment is how you get the fissile material, the uranium-235, needed for a bomb. You need it highly enriched.
So hitting Natanz directly targets their ability to actually produce that weapons-grade material. It's not just symbolic.
Exactly. And the sources also mentioned specific people were targeted, senior IRGC commanders.
The Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yeah, and nuclear scientists, too, which suggests it wasn't just about hitting buildings.
A multi-pronged approach then.
Yeah.
How did Israel frame it? What was their stated objective?
Prime Minister Netanyahu called it a targeted military operation to roll back the Iranian threat to Israel's very survival. Pretty strong words.
And he said it would continue.
Yep. For as many days as it takes. Some sources even gave it a name. Operation Rising Lion.
Rising Lion.
Okay.
Okay. And the specific goals beyond just hitting Natanz and personnel, what did the analysis suggest?
Well, it looks layered, crippling the nuclear program, sure, but also degrading Iran's ability to hit back.
Meaning their missile sites, air defenses.
Exactly, taking out ballistic missile launchers, air defense systems, and like you said, key people. Some analysis even floated the idea of regime decapitation.
Really? Targeting top leadership.
Potentially, naming people like Hossein Salami, the head of the IRGC.
Wow. So based on these sources, Israel sees this not just as retaliation, but as essential action against an existential threat.
That's the consistent framing, yes.
Okay, what about the U.S.? How did they react?
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio put out a statement, said the U.S. was not involved.
That specific phrasing, not involved.
Right. But he did acknowledge Israel's claim of self-defense.
And there was some context with former President Trump, too.
Yeah, sources recalled he'd apparently warned Netanyahu against this kind of strike before, but more recently sort of acknowledged it could very well happen, maybe signaling a shift or just accepting reality.
And the main U.S. concern voiced publicly.
Protecting American forces in the region, that seemed to be the top line.
Makes sense. Now, Iran's initial response, you said they launched drones.
They did, but interestingly, especially looking at some online chatter and early reports, some sources describe them as pretty ineffective. Almost.
For show.
Yeah, clearly for show was a phrase used, definitely seen as less impactful than the Israeli strikes.
And Iran publicly downplayed the damage.
Reportedly, yes, which some analysts took as a sign they might be looking for a way to de-escalate, an off-ramp.
Okay, so that sets the scene of the strikes and the immediate fallout. Now let's dig into the why. The strategic thinking. Let's start with Iran's perspective, based on these sources.
A huge piece is definitely their nuclear program. It's central in almost all the analysis.
And the strikes could actually push them faster.
That's the worry some experts raise, yeah. That this kind of attack could convince Iran's leadership they absolutely need a bomb for survival.
Like North Korea's thinking. The ultimate deterrent.
Exactly. So the strikes, meant to stop the program, could paradoxically accelerate it. A sprint for a bomb.
That's a really concerning potential outcome. What about Iran's internal situation? Did the sources mention that?
They did. There's talk about Khamenei being old, maybe unpopular succession isn't clear.
So the regime might feel shaky.
Could be. And that might make them hesitant about a full-blown war, fearing internal trouble.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Right. The flip side, some sources point to, is that this perceived weakness could actually make them more aggressive externally. Rally support, project strength. It's a complex calculation for them.
A real balancing act.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's switch to Israel's viewpoint. We know the existential threat framing on the nuclear issue. What else?
The sources paint a much broader picture, this idea of a seven-front war.
7 fronts. That sounds intense. What are they?
According to the analysis, Gaza, Lebanon with Hezbollah, the West Bank, Syria, Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen.
Wow. All directed by Iran.
That's Israel's perspective, yes. Fueled by what sources estimate is $7 billion a year from Iran into these proxies, building this ring of fire around Israel.
7 billion. That number really sticks out. It frames the threat differently.
Absolutely. And they don't even see it as just regional.
Meaning?
Some Israeli officials, according to the sources, frame this as part of a global war.
A global war. Involving whom?
An axis. Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, all working against the West.
What's the evidence cited for that?
A key example is Iranian drones being used by Russia in Ukraine. The tactics, the technology sharing, it suggests coordination beyond just the Middle East.
That's a major geopolitical framing. What about the proxies themselves? Have the recent conflicts, like in Gaza or with Hezbollah, weakened them?
Some analysis suggests Hamas is significantly crippled, and Hezbollah's military strength has been degraded.
So maybe Iran can't rely on them for immediate major retaliation.
That's the argument some sources make. But, and it's a big but, Hezbollah is still seen as a very serious ongoing threat by Israel. Degraded, yes, but still capable.
Okay, so weighing all that Iran's nuclear drive, the proxy network, Israel's threat perception, this global axis idea, what pushes things towards more fighting versus maybe calming down?
Well, for escalation, you've got the basic tit-for-tat cycle we've seen. Iran keeps advancing its nuclear program. The proxies are still active.
And the risk Iran might directly target U.S. interests.
That's a huge red line. If they hit U.S. ships or bases, things could spiral fast. Plus, that paradox we mentioned, Iran acting tough externally because they feel weak internally.
And any sign of disagreement between the U.S. and Israel.
Right. That daylight, as officials reportedly call it, it's seen as potentially emboldening adversaries.
Okay, what about the breaks, the de-escalation factors?
Well, Iran downplaying the damage could be a signal wanting that off-ramp. There also seems to be a general feeling, even among Arab states, that a full Israel-Iran war is just too catastrophic for everyone.
The economic fallout alone.
Exactly. If Iran tried closing the Strait of Hormuz, for instance, it would hurt them badly. Anger China. It's probably not sustainable.
And the proxies being somewhat degraded limits options.
It might in the short term. Plus, the U.S. is actively trying not to get dragged into a direct conflict.
Protecting U.S. forces is key for them.
And Israel's already engaged on multiple fronts, right? Gaza, Lebanon. If they feel they made their point with these strikes, hit key targets.
That could be reason enough to pause.
Potentially. Plus, the need to focus on what comes next in places like Gaza requires strategic bandwidth, too.
Let's talk more about the U.S. role. That security partnership with Israel keeps coming up in the sources.
Yeah, it's consistently described as incredibly strong, especially since October 7th. And one specific thing often highlighted is Israel moving into CENTCOM's area back in 2021.
CENTCOM being the U.S. Central Command for the Middle East. Why was that move so significant?
It just allowed for much deeper military cooperation and integration. Sources say this was crucial during Iran's April 13th attack.
How so?
CENTCOM forces, working with regional partners in Israel, were directly involved in shooting down those Iranian drones and missiles. It wasn't just theory, it was practical defense cooperation in action.
And you had the visible stuff, too, like the U.S. carrier groups, Biden's don't message.
Seen as major deterrence, according to the sources. And the tech collaboration is key, too.
Missile defense.
All those systems, Iron Dome, Arrow, David Sling, Patriot, that reportedly played a part. And the F-35 jet gets mentioned a lot.
For its stealth.
That, but also its role coordinating other aircraft, providing targeting data, like a quarterback in the sky. And it apparently got its first ever cruise missile interception during all this. It shows deep integration.
So operationally, very tight.
Yeah.
But politically, the sources mention some friction.
Yeah, concerns about public disagreements or maybe slowdowns in weapons deliveries, creating that daylight we talked about.
And Israeli officials worry this emboldens Iran.
That's the reported concern. That it weakens deterrence and hurts Israel's international standing, their strategic depth.
Strategic depth. Can you unpack that term a bit?
Sure. For a small country like Israel, surrounded by potential threats, it means having the ability to withstand an attack and fight back effectively. It relies on strong allies, advanced tech, and international legitimacy.
So perceived wavering from the U.S. undermines that buffer.
That's the argument presented in some sources. And how much the U.S. knew about or coordinated on these specific June 13th strikes is seen as really important for what happens next.
Let's shift to international law. It sounds like a tricky area regarding preemptive strikes.
Oh, absolutely. It's murky. Sources often bring up Israel's 1981 strike on Iraq's Osirak reactor.
Which was condemned by the UN, right? Even though Israel claimed self-defense.
Exactly. The legal benchmark often cited is the Caroline test from way back.
That requires the threat to be instant, overwhelming, leaving no choice.
Precisely, implying you're responding to something happening right now, not a potential future threat. And the UN Charter's Article 51 talks about self-defense if an armed attack occurs.
So the debate is whether hitting a nuclear program before it produces a weapon counts, especially when both sides see the other as a threat.
That's the core legal tension. And bodies like the UN Security Council, the International Court of Justice, they tend to interpret these rules pretty narrowly, focused on actual attacks.
And the IAEA, the nuclear watchdog.
They monitor and report on Iran's activities, which is crucial evidence. But even confirming Iran is advancing its program isn't legally the same as an armed attack under international law. So justifying a preemptive strike remains really contentious legally.
Okay, pulling it all together now. The strikes, the motives, the U.S. role, the law. What about the bigger picture? Did the markets react much?
Sources noted oil prices, Brent crude, did tick up, but interestingly, not into what analysts call crisis levels.
Why not?
Some analysis suggests stable energy policies globally have created a kind of buffer. It gives governments a bit more room to maneuver militarily without causing an immediate economic meltdown that forces their hand.
That's an interesting link between energy policy and geopolitics.
Yeah.
What's the general outlook now? More tension.
That seems to be the consensus in the sources, yes, continued tension. There's also speculation tied to the U.S. election cycle.
How so?
Some sources suggest Netanyahu might feel more able, depending on the outcome, to pursue what they term a more radical solution in Gaza or maybe other big projects.
And the central question about Iran's nuclear path remains.
Absolutely. Will they sprint for the bomb now? Or is there still a path for diplomacy, maybe pushed by outside powers? The sources really emphasize that U.S. and allied involvement, that coordination is going to be critical going forward. It's just incredibly volatile.
So we've taken this deep dive into the sources around Israel's recent strikes on Iran. We've looked at the stated reasons, the targets, the capabilities, the whole international dynamic, and what might come next.
Yeah, trying to piece together the different perspectives from the analysis, whether it's focused on the immediate military goals or these bigger geopolitical currents.
And as you think through all this information from the sources we've touched on, here's something to maybe chew on. This idea highlighted in some of the analysis that this isn't just Israel versus Iran.
Right, the framing that it's part of a wider global confrontation, the West versus an axis of Iran, Russia, China, North Korea.
If that way of seeing things keeps gaining ground, what are the long-term implications? How does that framing change the math for de-escalation? Or does it make future clashes seem almost inevitable?
And what role could international cooperation possibly play or fail to play if the major powers increasingly see this as just one front in a larger zero-sum global struggle? Something to keep considering as the situation continues to unfold.